Real quick, before we start this podcast episode, I just want to say thank you for tuning into the Marc Colcer podcast. I know you've got a million things that you could be doing right now, and the fact that you're taking time out of your day to watch this podcast episode truly means the world to me, and I just want to say thank you for that. If you'd like to continue to support the podcast, right below this video, if you could hit the subscribe button, and then, hey, if you got some more time and you want to hit the download button, the comment button, the like button, the share button, any of those buttons, it's greatly, greatly appreciated. It helps for other people to find out about the podcast, and it helps for you to be notified about future episodes. So if you guys could take a quick second, hit the subscribe button, I would really appreciate that. Outside of that, this episode and every other episode is brought to you guys by Roast Umber Coffee. As some of you guys know, I co-founded Roast Umber Coffee, and we have the greatest farmers in Guatemala and Honduras and the greatest roaster in Grand Rapids, Michigan, all to bring you guys the greatest cup of coffee possible. So if you'd like to try it out, go to our website, use the coupon code MARC30, and you're going to get 30% off your coffee. Now on to the episode. Thank you guys again for tuning in. Welcome to the Marc Colcer Podcast. Okay, so first off, I got to say thank you again for coming on to the podcast because everybody's watching this. This is the first time they've seen them, but this is my second time getting together with you to record this episode. And I had called you last week, and I said to you, I'm going to be honest, I don't like how I did. This subject is so important, and so it's something that I really wanted to make sure I did right, and I don't feel like my questions the first go-around were the best. And so I asked you if you'd be kind enough to come back here and record the episode, and I hoped you'd say yes, and you did. So I just want to say thank you for doing that because I know it's I value your time and value your expertise and everything like that. So I just want to say thank you for coming back and doing this today.
Thank you, Marc. I think you're being a little hard on yourself, but I'm happy to be back.
It's this is just a subject that I know is so important for people, and when I'm talking about something that in the grand scheme of things like doesn't really matter, it's easy to talk about, right? Because at the end of the day, it's if you're talking about sports or if you're talking about NFTs or investing or something like that, in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to really affect anybody's day, right? But this is something that it's a very important subject, and talking about therapy and talking about trauma, something that almost everybody has experienced in one way or another, is just such an important subject that I was like, we got to do this right. And by I got to do this right in terms of the questions I'm asking and things like that. So once again, I appreciate that. But to jump into things, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed therapist. I specialize in trauma therapy. I do EMDR. I also do a therapy called brain spotting. I've been practicing since 2016, and I do both in-person and virtual sessions. I'm licensed in California, Florida, and South Carolina. So I feel like I do a lot. I see people all over the country, particularly in the states that I'm licensed in. And I'm really passionate about trauma therapy. I'm really grateful that more and more people are seeking out therapy, and more people know about trauma therapy. They're actually calling me, asking me about EMDR because they've heard of it somewhere or a friend of theirs told them about it. So it seems like more and more people are open to talking about this and doing this work.
Yeah, it feels like our culture is like making progress when it comes to therapy. It used to be something that I think people were embarrassed of, and now it's something that I think people are proud to say, like, hey, I'm going to see a therapist, and I'm addressing some things that have happened in my past, and I just want to be the best version of myself. And the real way to be the best version of yourself is to address anything that may be holding you back. So I think it's great to see culture kind of coming around about therapy. And so what led you to wanting to get into trauma therapy, especially that particular type of therapy?
Yeah, it was sort of like a happy accident, actually. When I was in my pre-licensed years, I was under supervision by specifically a trauma therapist. She did EMDR as well. And I just basically became so passionate about it. At the time, I wasn't fully aware that I had been through trauma. Like I was going to therapy, but I didn't have fully that insight. And the more and more I got into this field, the more and more I studied, I realized that I needed to do my own work. And I specifically sought out EMDR at that time. It completely changed my life. So that's, definitely the reason why I got into it, because not only am I passionate about it, I sought out the therapy for myself and really worked through some issues that I needed to work through as well.
That's awesome. And it's good to know that worked for you, and then therefore, and it's probably very rewarding then to see it working for other people, and seeing people living their best life after going through a session or however many sessions with you. It's cool to see the results live in action. So
Totally.
So I want to start off with talking about recognizing trauma. I feel like trauma is something that a lot of people kind of push under the rug, right? And I feel like a lot of people just almost act like it didn't happen, or that their trauma that they experience isn't like big enough to be a big enough deal to talk about, right? And so is that something that you commonly see?
All the time, actually. And I feel like people, again, maybe they're avoiding or denying that they've been through significant trauma or anything distressing or traumatic in general because they're trying to protect themselves. I feel like it's a protective defense mechanism to say, oh no, that didn't happen to me, I'm fine. When in reality, things in their lives may not be fine. And so typically what I see, and this isn't everyone, there are some people that have that insight right away and they say, you know, I went through this and I really know that I need to work through it. And then there are others where maybe it's not necessarily they're coming in specifically for trauma, but for example, they're having trouble in their relationships, or they're depressed and they don't know why. Or they're highly anxious and the anxiety feels so out of control. So it's typically something else is going on. And then the more and more we work together, we find like, oh, you actually went through a lot in your childhood, or, oh, that relationship was actually abusive. I don't know if you know that. And so sometimes it takes some time for people to really sink in that, you know, that experience or those chronic experience were unfortunately traumatic.
So going into that, then, what would you consider trauma?
So I would say for a lot of us, therapists and individuals as well, in my opinion, I feel like people have their own definitions of what was traumatic. So things that I think we can all agree are traumatic, for example, are individuals like veterans who have been through combat war, experiencing physical abuse, sexual assault, things like that. For example, I think we can all agree that that was abuse and traumatic in their lives. But the other component that I would say that I think sometimes people may miss is, for example, if there was neglect in childhood, or, you know, if you were, for example, like moving around a lot and that was extremely distressing for you. Not all distress is trauma, but all trauma is distressful. So I typically let everyone just tell me what they felt like was traumatic. And then I also work with individuals in identifying, well, you know, that actually sounds like it was a narcissistic abusive relationship, for example, or you went through chronic neglect and abandonment in your childhood. What was that like for you? So I would say trauma can be on the spectrum. There's like big T traumas that I first mentioned, and then potentially little T traumas.
Are there any specific signs of trauma that we should look to see if like a particular event or situation has affected us more than we realize?
Well, the signs would likely be the symptoms. So if you're having nightmares, if you're avoiding certain people or certain places, if you're hypervigilant in specific situations, if you have PTSD responses like the fight or flight, fawn response, freeze response, you know, the symptomology, I would say, is what kind of tells us that something is off, something may have happened that, you know, your body and your mind is not okay with. So we want to look at that. And then if it was something that maybe happened a while ago, it may not show up as PTSD symptoms. It may more so show up as you're depressed and you don't know why, or you're highly anxious and you're not sure why. Those are some of the signs of noticing if there was potentially trauma or not.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I feel like all of us in our lives, we experience so many different things. And the way I grew up is different than the way you grew up, and your experiences are different than my experiences, which are different than the person who's listening to this and their experiences, right? And we talked about this on the first episode. You had asked me in one way or another if there was trauma in some way that I had experienced. And I had talked about how, for me, going through Accutane and being on Accutane 3 different times and for basically over the course of 6 years for really, really bad acne had affected my ability to date, and that I was really, I guess I had this built up trauma from my childhood of not feeling like I was good looking enough, or feeling like when people looked at me, they didn't like what they saw and things like that. And that affected me pretty much from 16 to 25, 26. And that's a long period, but I never really realized it until some conversations that I had in my mid 20s with some different people, where all of a sudden I like broke down and started crying for the first time about it. And it was just something that I had built up for so long, because for me, it felt like, well, that was my life. It wasn't trauma. It was just a thing that I dealt with, right? But yet it was trauma. It was a specific trauma that I had dealt with that somebody else may not understand or relate to if they didn't experience something like that. But for me, it was, going in and out of a dermatologist's office basically like twice a week for 6 years, and and being constantly on antibiotics that were messing with my body and things like that. And so, realizing that, and then eventually, talking with friends and kind of saying like, hey, I'm going to be honest, like my self-confidence isn't the greatest because I have always kind of, masked that by being sometimes the funny guy and things like that. But I really need to address the fact that my self-confidence has been hurt by my childhood and what I've experienced. And ever since I started talking about it, it lowered the effect that situation had on me. Now I can openly talk with anybody about the fact that I was, I had really, really bad skin, and I can understand that about somebody else who's going through a similar experience because I went through that for so long and still deal with it to this day. So it's one of those things that never really, stops affecting you, but you learn to, I guess, deal with, I guess.
Absolutely. And yeah, in that example, that was a highly distressing, traumatic experience for you because not only did it impact your self-esteem, but you also mentioned that it impacted your body and medically how you were feeling, right? But to somebody else, maybe having acne was probably annoying and very frustrating, but they likely didn't have potentially some of the similar issues that you were having. So I feel like we can identify what was traumatic for us because of what emotions it brought us, how we functioned after that, what it did to our self-esteem and our core value and our core beliefs. So yeah, your experiences are totally valid.
And I think it goes back to the fact that I feel like, compare traumas too much, right? And so I for a long time told myself, well, what you've gone through, what you've experienced isn't that big a deal compared to what somebody else has gone through who's gone through, what society would consider worse, right? But at the same time, it still was trauma. There was the better half of my freshman year of college, I used to wear a hoodie and like sunglasses and go to the cafeteria looking like that because I didn't want people to see my face because I was embarrassed because there were web forums that made fun of how bad my acne was. And so I was embarrassed. And once again, it's like, yes, there are people who had it worse, but what you've experienced is valid. And that took a long time for me to understand. And I think there's a lot of people who right now are probably listening to this and have to, come to that realization themselves that what they've experienced is valid and that, yes, somebody else may have, had bigger trauma or whatever, but your trauma still matters and your experience still matters and what you've dealt with has matters, and so therefore addressing it matters.
Yeah, pain is pain. There's no use in comparing our pain to somebody else's pain. Sure, another person's experience may feel like there's more gravity to it as an example, but like I said, pain is pain, and it's important to value and validate what we each have gone through in our lives.
How common would you say is like subconscious trauma? So trauma that somebody may have experienced at a young age, or just trauma in general that's not tied to maybe a specific event, but just subconsciously?
Well, I think it does depend on, for example, like the environment at the very least, right? Because maybe there wasn't like a specific event that happened. I'm actually supervising a therapist right now, and she's working with a young child, an 8-year-old, where the 8-year-old is having just a lot of defiant behaviors and the parents are not sure why. And lo and behold, when we do more assessment with the family, the child, doesn't feel valued by the dad because mom is the one doing more of the caregiving. The household doesn't have a lot of structure to it. And again, not to shame a family. I know a family is doing the very best that they can, but a child may grow up feeling neglected or abandoned if at 8 years old, you're not feeling connected or valued by one of your caregivers. So I don't know if I necessarily would say like subconscious. Maybe, sure, on a conscious level, maybe we're not aware that that was an issue in our childhood. But the more and more we explore it, the more and more we can realize like, hey, that was not cool that I didn't really have a connection with my dad in my childhood. So that definitely tends to be a very common experience where maybe something was normalized in our households, in our environment. But when we grow up, we have a little bit more insight and realize, well, that's not okay.
And I feel like a lot of times, especially with my generation and then older generations and things, we're kind of taught, well, toughen up, right? Like there are people who have it worse and things like that. But now we're shifting to, society is shifting to, hey, let's talk about it. Let's address these things. Let's talk about, who you are and what your experiences are and things like that. And it's good to see us addressing a lot of these different things and getting people to open up, because for so long it was just basically, especially as a man, told to like shut up and deal with it, and that you need to be this badass tough guy and you don't need to feel emotion and things like that. And now we're shifting to, hey, you can be whatever you want to be, but feel free to open up and talk about your experiences and speak your truth, because your truth is your truth. And so, it's good to see people addressing those things.
Yeah, self-validation is such a gift.
It is. It really is. So what happens to our body and in our brain when trauma occurs?
Yeah, so, we talk a lot about fragmentation as trauma therapists. So I can talk a little bit about, for example, like PTSD symptoms. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. With PTSD, we see things like having flashbacks, having nightmares, avoiding certain places, being hypervigilant, as an example. And PTSD, the criteria for PTSD or acute stress disorder is either you yourself experiencing a traumatic incident or witnessing a traumatic incident. So those are one of the things that, we'd want to be aware of, like, am I having more nightmares right now? Am I having flashbacks and I don't know why? Those are some of the things that happen I think when we look at big picture as well, and I do a lot of what I call parts work. There's another type of therapy called internal family systems, where we look at an individual based off of different parts of ourselves. So I may be working with an adult, for example, but they experienced trauma, let's say as an example, when they were 5. There's a fragmented 5-year-old part within them that may be more highly emotional or show up in different situations. Even though now we're adults, we're in an adult body, but a certain situation may trigger that 5-year-old part of us to come out, perhaps be a little bit more emotional, perhaps feel a little bit more triggered. And so I also see that happen when we work with survivors, that at times they don't even feel like adults. At times they might say, when that situation happened in my relationship, I almost felt like I was a teenager again. And again, lo and behold, the trauma happened when they were 15. So those are some of the other things that we look at when we work with trauma. The other thing that we want to look at as well is oftentimes adults that have experienced either maybe one incident, but for sure chronic traumatic incidents, like incidents that happen over and over, is that they may find themselves as adults in situations that remind them of what happened in childhood. So let's say a kid grow up with, in a domestic violence situation where a parent, was abusing their spouse. They may find themselves, maybe not in the exact same relationship, but they may find themselves in a similarly like very toxic or abusive relationship. That doesn't happen with everyone, but it can be quite common because we tend to subconsciously seek out situations that are familiar, even though they're not the best for us, but they're familiar to us. And in a way, it's almost like our psyche is trying to sort of recreate a situation so that we can fix it. We're not consciously for sure doing that, but it's an unconscious thing that happens within the brain.
Wow, that's really interesting. What would you say is important for our society overall to understand about trauma?
Well, I would say it's important to pay attention to, because like you said, it's not one of those situations where like we have to just toughen up and get through it. That's not how it works. That's not how we work through PTSD. It's important to acknowledge what's happening. It's important to acknowledge what the body is experiencing, what the brain is experiencing. And it's also important to identify that if somebody is going through that, we need help. We need to support them. So I think for society at large, it's important to acknowledge that if someone is not okay, then we need to support that. We need to be there for them. So, I think there's a bigger existential conversation we can have about that. But the important thing that I always share is that self-validation, like I said, is a gift, and it's important to validate our own experiences, and that we shouldn't necessarily minimize them.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I know for some, the idea of going to see a therapist for the first time is overwhelming. And so I was hoping we could make it a little bit easier for them and kind of go over some questions that someone may ask during their first therapy session. So I'm going to kind of play the role of the person who's going to see the therapist. And so first question, how do you think therapy can help me?
Well, I think therapy can be helpful because I'm an unbiased person in your life, and I can support you in identifying, maybe certain patterns that perhaps you're not fully aware of, or I can also support you in identifying what coping skills you might need if there's something going on that's not working for you. Therapy can also be helpful because we can identify where in your life you want to see improvements, and we can talk about, ways in which we can get there. I mentioned earlier, I do EMDR, I do brain spotting for clients, with clients, and that can also be helpful if you're feeling like you've gone through significant distressing experiences and you're still feeling activated. You're still feeling that sort of like internal fight or flight response. So therapy can be helpful in many ways.
And then how should I prepare for my first session?
The biggest thing I would say is, and look, not everyone knows this from the get-go, but the biggest thing I would say is to really think about what you want to get out of that time and what your goals are. You may not know what your goals are at the beginning, and that's okay. That can also be up for exploration in sessions. But, if your goal, for example, is to decrease your anxiety symptoms, or let's say to sleep better, or to communicate, a little bit more assertively in your relationship, it's helpful to have an idea, because as a therapist, I can't obviously read anybody's mind. So I may have an idea of what could be supportive for you, Marc, if you were my client, but maybe you have a completely different goal. So I think it's really important to really think about, what are my goals? What do I want to get out of this time? And how can I achieve that?
And then would you say, how often should you meet with somebody, ideally?
Ideally, I typically say once a week. Therapy sessions are approximately an hour, and I would say to really get the benefit, at least at the very beginning when you're starting, attend weekly, because you can make really good headway with your goals.
And then is there anything anybody should be doing in between sessions to help with their therapy?
Yeah, so I'm someone that likes to really give clients things to either think about or things to practice, whether it's, very basic things like journaling, or it might be some of the grounding tools that we've worked on in therapy sessions. Therapy, if you think about it, it is just 1 hour a week. And I'm not saying that time isn't useful, but if you're wanting to make specific changes and you want to make headway with those changes, I often recommend to do some of the things that your therapist advises in between sessions. So for trauma, I would say at the beginning, from the get-go, a lot of it is a lot of grounding exercises, because so much of surviving trauma is just being in that survival mode. Sometimes we're not even like fully in our bodies. So I think grounding tools, doing things like mindfulness, movement of any kind, exercising, walking, dancing, things like that are really, really good for the body.
And then how will I know if therapy is working?
I think you would define that, right? Like,
Yeah.
are you coming in feeling stronger? Are you better able to manage anxiety? Do you feel a little bit more assertive and boundaried in your relationships? It's when you're seeing a little bit more confidence in the things that you want to change.
There we go. And then how many sessions does it typically take before somebody may notice improvement?
Yeah, so honestly, I wish I could define like, if you do 6 sessions or if you do 12 sessions, you're going to see this happen. Unfortunately, I can't give like a specific number, just because every individual is different. Everyone's experiences are different, and every person's brain is different. Every person processes therapy and grounding tools and EMDR and information very differently at their own pace. So, it's hard to say, but I will say that if you give therapy a minimum of 3 to 4 months, and you attend on a weekly basis and you're committed, you may see some positive changes. You may not see everything that you want to see, but you may notice that, let's say, for example, you have a little bit more insight, or you're learning how to set better boundaries, or you have better self-care tools going on in your day-to-day life. So it just kind of depends on the individual.
Do you ever, this is, I guess, more of just a random question, but before you begin a session, is there ever anything that you look for in order to make sure somebody's a good client potentially for you?
Well, I always look for, is the client safe? So with trauma, unfortunately, individuals, for example, they experience suicidal ideation if just the depression and the trauma is very severe, or they may have, unfortunately, self-harming behavior. So of course, I first assess, are you safe? Do we need to establish some safety plans so that, we can move forward together? Or perhaps do you need a higher level of care? Maybe the once a week is not appropriate. I look at that first. And then second of all, I also look at, what are the supports in your life? So oftentimes people think that they can do things on their own. And certainly I'm not saying that you can't, but healing, doesn't necessarily happen in isolation. We do need supportive individuals in our lives. Sometimes it's friends and family. Maybe it's not in your particular situation. So some of the support could be, having a athletic community that you do sports with, or it can be group therapy, or it can be 12-step programs. So I also look at that, because if you're someone that's a little bit more isolated in your life, one of the goals that I will recommend is let's increase your social support so that you have people outside of your therapist to really lean on if you need.
There we go. So I wanted to talk about, when I was doing my research for the podcast, I came across, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn as the common responses to trauma. And so could you describe those for people who aren't familiar?
Yeah, so when we experience either true danger or perceived danger, what happens is our amygdala in our brain starts to fire and says, danger, danger, you need to do something right now. And it sends those signals to the rest of the body. So each person has their own trauma response. Like you said, there's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fighting is literally, I'm going to fight you to get out of this situation. Flight means I'm going to run. I'm going to get out of here to get out of this situation. Freeze means you're going to freeze and you're not going to move to essentially alleviate the situation or wait for that situation to end. And then fawn means you're appeasing the situation. You're appeasing the threat until the threat is over. Every person has their own PTSD and trauma response. It's not something that we can kind of cognitively or rationally think about. So it's not like, let's say, I live in an area by the mountains, and we unfortunately have a lot of coyotes around. So at night when I'm walking my dog, I'm already on high alert. I'm making sure that it's a safe environment to walk around. But I know my natural PTSD response is to freeze. That's just historically what has happened for me. It's not something where I consciously think I'm going to freeze right now. In the situation though that I just mentioned of walking my dog in an area where there might be coyotes, I know that I have to fight that because I can't run from a coyote. They're going to outrun me. So I have to make myself bigger and to show that I'm not intimidated by them so that they're going to run away and not mess with me. So those are some of the things that, when we have a traumatic event, or again, a perceived traumatic event, our body just goes into that survival mode.
And that was something that I think we even talked about on the first podcast episode. And I told you about a situation in college where a buddy of mine was a DJ, and a guy grabbed the mic from the DJ. And so my buddy said to me, hey, can you get the mic back from him? And so I went up to him. I was like, hey, man, can I get the mic back? And he kind of turned away from me. And so when he did, I grabbed the mic from him, and he turns and punches me in the face. And I mean, he hit me into next week. And so my eye ended up being shut for 4 days, and it was a crazy experience. But I froze in that moment because I was not expecting to get punched. And so he punched me in the face, and I stood there like that. And for a long time afterwards, I was like, well, why'd you respond that way? He could have easily hit you again. And because at that time, my body recognized this guy is much larger than me. He was like 6'5". I'm not that big. And that I was not going to win that fight, right? And so I couldn't run because I was in a situation where I was surrounded by people. And so the only proper response from my body at that moment was to freeze. And so it goes back to what you just said a second ago, is that it's involuntary. Your body just naturally does it because it's in our DNA to respond to trauma in whatever way is the I guess, the best way to protect yourself. And so I think my body subconsciously at that time was like, hey, if you freeze here and don't fight back, it's likely he just, someone separates it or he moves on or whatever. Yeah. But if you attempt to fight back or whatever, well, then he's going to fight back and you're going to lose that battle. I never realized at that time why my body did that. But when I was doing research for this and was reading about the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, I was really, shocked by how much I could relate to that moment, because I never really realized why I did that until reading about that.
Absolutely. That response kept you safe. It kept you safe from that situation potentially escalating. So your brain did what it needed to do to survive that moment.
Yeah, so when I was doing more research on this episode, I was listening to a podcast by Caroline Strawson, which I'll link in the description of this video. But in that podcast, she talked about how it's pretty common for people to be stuck in the freeze response and that they don't always realize it. And she described being stuck in the freeze response as difficulty making decisions, when you wake up and you don't really want to get out of bed and you don't want to see anyone, just kind of hide away, when you feel disassociated or numb, when you just feel really stuck overall, when you feel exhausted, when you're in your body but you don't feel anything because it's too painful to feel, and then you essentially start to isolate because you don't want anyone to hurt you or criticize you or judge you. And so that was just something that I found really interesting, because I think, once again, when we think of the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, I think we think about it in that moment, but I had never really thought about it carrying over, right?
Sure.
And it does seem like you do hear people describe some of those symptoms and those experiences and things like that. And so is there anything that you recommend for somebody who may feel stuck in the freeze response?
Yeah. So like I said, when you're stuck in that freeze response, it's likely, again, out of survival. Like the individual was talking about, it's likely too hard to feel or too hard to fully be present in your body. So it's out of survival. And so the first thing I would want to ask is, again, are you safe? Is your environment physically safe? Is your environment emotionally safe? The first example that comes to my mind is, abuse. Are you in an abusive relationship? Is you being in that freeze mode necessary to survive emotionally what's going on? So I would first essentially look at that just to, identify like what is going on in the environment before I recommend anything to an individual. But if your environment is safe and then the freeze response is mainly just because, a fragmented part of you doesn't know that your environment is safe right now, it may, of course, be beneficial to do a lot of grounding exercises. So when I say grounding, we therapists basically say it's to get us back into the present. It's to get us back into knowing that actually me being in the room in here with you is safe. I'm not in any sort of danger. So what we want to do is different things to help with that. So I mentioned earlier movement. Movement can be really helpful to get us a little bit more in touch with our body. So exercising, walking, dancing, swimming, anything to get your body moving can be very helpful. The other piece that I would say is I really like an exercise called the 5 senses exercise, and that just helps get you in touch with your different senses. So I can walk everyone through it right now. We can name, for example, 5 different things that are around us in our room. So I can name the couch, I can name the table, I could name the mirror, I can name, the ceiling, I can name the plant. That's the one sense. The next sense is touch. What different things can you touch around you? I can touch the couch, I can touch my pants, I can touch the coffee mug that's right there. The next one would be hearing. What do you hear around you? And naming different things that you can hear. The second piece would be naming different things that you can smell. And then the final piece would be naming different things that you can taste. Getting in touch with our senses is a really great way of getting you back into the present and coming out of that freeze state. Other things that you can do are, of course, very basic. Like I even ask people, like, can you name today's date? What day does it feel today? Can you look at your hands? You're in adult hands right now. You're not a child anymore. Look, you're in an adult body. That can definitely help in bringing you back into the present. And also just, again, naming different things that you see in the room can also be helpful, just to see like, oh yeah, I'm not in the location where the accident happened. That is a very, very helpful to get you back to the present moment.
Do you recommend people literally like say that out loud, or in their head just kind of go, okay, in my head, okay, I can see the coffee cup, I can see I can see the mic, I can see, yet, or should you literally say it out loud?
Whatever works for you. Honestly, some people find it to be a little bit more grounding and powerful to say it out loud. Other people need to say it in their head. Some people need to write it down, and that helps. So whatever works for you. A lot of doing these exercises are trial and error. I also tell people you can do different things like, for example, washing your face with cold water. That can bring you back into your body. I also recommend some people carry ice packs, in their home, and to place the ice pack either behind your neck or on your temples, on your face. That again cools your body down and brings you back to the present moment a little bit better. So there are a lot of different exercises that you can do. And of course, I'm always going to recommend going to a trauma therapist to work with you as you're going in and out of those freeze states.
And I think it's interesting too, because when you talk about describing the things around you or, things you hear or whatever, when you talk about saying it out loud, I think the most common thing that people think in their head is like, well, that sounds fucking crazy. I'm going to be talking to myself, right? And yet it's like that's the sort of thing that I feel like you need to do, because it's something that's outside your comfort zone, right? A little bit, because you're doing something different. You don't tend to just talk to yourself out loud, right? And so then if I'm sitting there and I'm going through a hard day and I don't feel, if I feel like I'm stuck in the freeze response, and then I'm just like, I see a coffee cup, I see a peace sign, I see a candle, I see a microphone, I see a chair, and then I hear the traffic outside. I don't hear much other than that, and because we have headphones on, and you start describing some of these things, I almost feel like I would start to feel like goofy describing it that way, but maybe that's what I need to snap me back into reality, right?
Yes.
And you talked about movement, and it's like, because I was watching another one where they were watching a video, and they were talking about, tapping on your legs, tapping on your arms, things like that, and then just kind of like shaking it out. And at one point she was like, you might just start laughing because you're just like shaking it out and you feel goofy as hell, but like that's what you need to snap back.
Yes. I can even say this happened to me today. I don't know if you saw, there's this, unfortunately, a very disturbing documentary that I was watching on Netflix earlier regarding a fundamentalist cult. And even though I have no history with this cult, I have not been a part of cult, it was insanely disturbing for me to watch. And I was like, almost like feeling sick to my stomach, like watching some of the things. That's, by the way, vicarious trauma. We can talk about that too. So I was experiencing like my own visceral, like body reaction after I finished that documentary. And I was like, I need to do something to take care of myself right now. So I literally did that. I literally like looked around and I was like, okay, where am I? I'm in my house right now. Let me look outside. What does it look like outside? It's a bright, sunny day. It looks so pretty outside. And I went for a little walk, and that helped me get back into the moment of like, oh yeah, I am nowhere near these dangerous people. I am completely safe. And it's like, we have to do that sometimes because, again, when our body is telling us that information, like I'm feeling numb, or I feel checked out, or I feel icky, or I feel gross, we have to do what we need to do to take care of ourselves. So it could be doing the senses exercise. It could be shaking it out. Like you just mentioned, like it's important to get back into the present.
I think what I typically do, I put on music, and then I live alone, so I'll like sing a rap to myself, and then it's like, man, if anybody walked in, it would be the most embarrassing thing for them to witness, because I have no musical talent, and also I usually have headphones in, so you wouldn't even hear what I'm listening to. You would just see me singing or rapping, but it helps me kind of get back into my groove and help me feel back to myself, and so it's I almost mentally kind of think to myself, well, what if you were like in a music video right now, and then I'll sing and I'll rap or whatever, and no one's there to judge me, nobody's there to watch me or whatever, and so it just makes me kind of snaps me back into reality, and then I feel much better. And I guess I never really realized what I was doing, but it makes sense now as to why we do some of these things.
Yeah.
So so you talked a second ago. Actually, what was that documentary called for people who want to watch it?
Gosh, it's Sleep Sweet something like that. It's about the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints religion, but it's really a cult.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you talked about vicarious traumas.
Yes.
So talk about that. What is that?
So vicarious trauma is essentially us not directly experiencing the trauma itself, but it's either like watching that documentary or hearing a story or watching images of something very disturbing where maybe like I mentioned earlier, it didn't necessarily happen to us, but we feel that intensity, we feel the pain, we feel the compassion and the burnout, compassion fatigue from that experience. The best thing that I can describe, I think I may have talked about it the first time we talked, but there was unfortunately a war in Armenia that started in 2020, and there was just a lot of crazy videos and crazy images circulating on social media of just disturbing stuff. I'm just going to say that. And I remember I had to just like stop, looking at that because it was so disturbing that I felt those PTSD responses. I felt icky. I felt gross. I felt hypervigilant. I started to have nightmares, and I just knew like I need to protect myself and I need to shield myself, as sad as those images and what those individuals were experiencing. And that's essentially what vicarious trauma is. Like it's seeing images that are so disturbing that we feel that sense of intensity and that sense of numbness and disconnection following it.
Yeah, I think I feel like sometimes there was the shooting in, I want to say it was Buffalo a few weeks ago, and the video of the shooter live streamed it. And so when I went on Twitter, I unfortunately didn't realize what I was watching, and then I watched him shoot somebody, and that messed with me, and I had to just turn off, kind of turn off my computer and just go watch something that was fun and light and comedy or whatever, because I was like, I need to just get myself out of that mindset, because that was so disturbing to see that and not realize even what I was witnessing. And so yeah, it is an interesting thing to think about, vicarious trauma and some of the things that we've watched. I even feel like I've experienced that at times before when I watch a documentary or watch a movie that talks about slavery, and the idea of somebody doing that to another person just messes with my brain so much, because I'm like, I could never imagine how somebody would be able to do that and not think what they were doing was so incredibly wrong.
Right.
And so I always have to kind of watch something like fun afterwards, because I'm like, otherwise it just like puts me in this like mindset of like, I just can't believe people were able to do that. So
yeah.
So we've talked about EMDR, and so I wanted to, talk more specifically about that. So when you talk about addressing trauma and things like that, you've talked about grounding exercises, you've talked about brain spotting, which we'll get into in a second, and you've also talked extensively about EMDR, and that you actually practiced EMDR yourself to deal with past trauma that you've experienced. And so can you describe what is EMDR?
Yeah, so EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It was developed by a psychologist. Her name is Francine Shapiro. She developed it back in the 80s, kind of by accident, actually. The story that I've heard when I first did my training is that she was, I believe, a therapist practicing some other form of therapy, whether it was a CBT or something else. And she was going through something distressing, and she found that she was moving her eyes back and forth, right, left. And she actually found that she was feeling a lot better when she was doing that. And the more and more she practiced it and sort of put it into a protocol, she found that it could be incredibly healing for individuals that go through it. And so the idea behind it is we are moving our eyes bilaterally back and forth, or doing some other bilateral movement, whether it's bilateral tapping that you were showing us earlier, or we can have bilateral sounds. And the idea behind it is that helps us get to the deeper subcortical parts of our brain. When we, for example, talk about a trauma, we stay in the rational part of our brain. We stay in the prefrontal cortex. That's where a lot of our cognitive, rational beliefs are. When we talk about trauma, I think all of us rationally, for the most part, know that it's not our fault of what we've experienced. But unfortunately, what happens is so much of trauma is physical. It stays in our body. So much of trauma is emotional. It gets stored in our limbic system, where our emotions are stored in the brain. And so when we just talk about trauma, unfortunately, it can be very limiting in our ability to work through it. So EMDR, and doing that back and forth bilateral stimulation is what we call it, can help us get to the deeper parts of our brain, so we can reprocess the memory or reprocess the experience, so we can either work through the negative core beliefs, the beliefs that we're holding on to with it, or the body sensations that we're holding on to with it, and see the traumatic event from a more neutral space, to reprocess it so that it doesn't take a hold or activate us so much the way that it used to.
So basically, if I have it correct, you ask questions about the experience and they talk about the experience and things like that. And then I'm talking about the experience, you're maybe moving your hands back and forth and I'm following that with my eyes. And it essentially, the goal is to desensitize yourself to that memory?
Desensitization is a part of EMDR. That's what the D stands for. And so, yeah, the more and more we expose ourselves to either the traumatic memory or the worst part of the memory, the less powerful it can be in our brain. Initially, though, it may feel like a lot. Initially, you may feel worse before you feel better. I do share that honesty with people. But again, the idea with EMDR is we're not trying to stay in the cognitive part of our brain. We're trying to go deeper to explore what are the core beliefs that you're holding on to. Can we get in touch with the shame that seems to be taking a hold on you? Can we focus also on where you feel that intensity in your body, where maybe you're holding on to that memory? Is it that your heart is racing, or do you feel icky somewhere in your body, as an example? It's to get to those deeper points where maybe with just talking about it, we're missing that when we just talk about trauma.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So are there specific types of trauma that EMDR tends to be most effective with?
You know, all types of trauma, we can work on single incident traumas. You know, if you were just maybe in a car accident and you just want to feel better getting back in the car and driving, we can work with single incident traumas, and we can also work with what we call complex trauma, where perhaps the trauma was chronic, it was ongoing in your life. So it's certainly all types of trauma. We definitely work with, I personally work a lot with sexual assault. I work with sexual assault survivors, but it can be done with physical abuse. It can be done with experiencing combat war. It can be done with, panic attacks, if that's a result of the traumatic experience. It can be worked with substance abuse, if that was, the way to cope with the traumatic incidents. It can be really done with any type of trauma.
Is there any sort of visible response that somebody should potentially be aware that they might, you said it might get worse before it gets better. Is there any sort of visible response that when you're first doing this with somebody that they may experience, just for them to be prepped for, hey, this could happen?
Yeah, every person is different. I feel like I get such different responses when I work with clients with EMDR. First of all, I'll say, as an EMDR therapist, when you first come into session with me, I'm not going to throw you right into the trauma right away. That's not what it is. That wouldn't even be ethical for me to do. We do first assessment, of course, and then I support clients in doing a lot of what we call EMDR resourcing to help your body feel safe, for you to feel comfortable with me, because maybe you're not comfortable with me right away. And then once we have a good foundation there, then we can start working on the traumatic memories. But honestly, people tell me all types of things after EMDR sessions. Sometimes they'll tell me, I actually feel so much more energized today than I did the previous day. Or other people will tell me, yeah, I feel so tired after that session. It can be anything. Some people tell me, I had a lot of dreams after EMDR. That was very interesting. So it can be anything. Again, every person's brain is different. I know for me personally, when I did EMDR for the first time, my therapist checked in with me the following day, and I legitimately texted her and I said, oh my gosh, I felt like I've been hit by a bus. Like, I was so drained from that experience. But then it got better the more and more memories that I was working on, and the more foundation and grounding and safety I felt.
You may have answered this already, but I just want to make sure I ask this. Can EMDR treat symptoms without an identifiable trigger event?
Well, with EMDR, we do want to at least identify something that we're working on. We call it a target memory. So even if you don't have like an actual memory from the experience, like for example, if the trauma happened like pre-verbal, like maybe before you were even talking, we can start by at least noticing what you feel physically and emotionally and start there. But we do like to at least ask, like, is there something specific, either a specific memory or a specific experience that is triggering you that we can work on today?
Okay. And then what does being healed look like, or what does healing overall look like?
It's so unique and so different for each individual. One individual might say, I just feel better. I just feel like I can walk through the world with a higher self-esteem and a little bit more confidence. Other people might say, I'm less anxious and I'm so happy about that. Other people will say, and this was my personal experience with trauma, I felt healed when I felt like I could make meaning from the experience that I went through. It's part of the reason why I'm a trauma therapist now. Like, I really just want to give back to others that are looking to do this work. I made meaning from my experience. That was what was healing for me. So that was, my component in trauma healing and trauma recovery. But other people will say, I feel more confident in myself. That's what's healing for me. Or I finally got out of that really unfortunate relationship and I'm not going to stand for some of the things that I went through anymore. And that was healing for them. I feel like every individual has their own definition of what is considered healing.
For me, I knew that my self-confidence had improved when during college, when I went to college from 2010 to 2014, Twitter just became a thing. And so people used to tweet some wild shit. People are much more careful about what they say now. Back then, people just let it fly, right? And so a few years ago, I was able to go back and search my name on Twitter and read the comments that people had written about me and be okay with it. Because when I was in college, I can't remember when exactly it happened, but my mom had called me crying one day and said that my aunt had showed her some of the tweets that people had said about me. And more or less, like I was a pretty well-known person on campus because I was throwing events and things like that. And because I was a young guy doing that, a lot of times people just wanted to shit on somebody essentially. And so the comments were pretty brutal. If I can find some of them, I'll actually add them in the thing so people can see them. I'll black out names, but I was able to read them and not be bothered by that. And that was something where I knew, okay, hey, that experience, while I remember how traumatic it was at the time, because, having my mom call me crying and saying, hey, how can we get people to stop this? And I said to her, I was like, Mom, it's because I'm like doing things on campus and whatnot. And so I'm trying to make things happen for myself. And as a result of that, you become a target. And so I was like, I know I've become a target and I just have to be okay with that, or I have to stop what I'm doing. But why would I want them to win?
Yeah.
And so, but it still was difficult for me to read those comments. It didn't make them any easier to read, but I knew that it was something that I was going to have to get used to. And so I eventually became numb to it. Right. And now I'm at the point where I can read those back and I don't hold any anger towards those people or anything like that. I just think to myself, I'm like, man, I hope they're good. I hope that whatever hate they had in their heart or whatever, any of that emotion, I hope they're doing well today. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to judge them off one of their worst moments and things like that. And so right now I just, hey, I hope you guys are doing well. And that's when I knew that experience didn't hold the power over me that it once did. I could read those and be totally fine.
Absolutely. And you brought up something else for me when you were saying that. It's one of the biggest things that we work on in this type of therapy is the goal, of course, like we can't erase the memory. We can't erase, that you had people writing to you such god-awful things. But like you said, when you read them now, it doesn't trigger, any of those like PTSD responses or those activating feelings. And that's part of the goal with this work too. Now I can think about those memories from the past and I feel neutral about it. It's not that I feel happy regarding those memories, but it's not causing me to feel anxious or depressed or highly activated the way that I used to. And that's another significantly component of trauma healing, when you can think about it and it doesn't hold you in the same way that it used to.
Yeah, I read earlier, it says the goal of EMDR isn't to forget the painful memory, but to take the emotional reactivity and feelings of being, take that and the feeling of being overwhelmed by it and remove that essentially.
Yes.
So, yeah, no, it's a really interesting type of therapy that I wasn't too familiar with until I had reached out to you and then did a lot of research into it. And so you also talked about brain spotting. So can you explain what brain spotting is?
Yeah, I love brain spotting too. So brain spotting, the best way that I can describe it, it's kind of like a cousin of EMDR. The developer, his name is David Grand. He's also a psychologist. And he was actually an EMDR therapist for a while. And he was doing that bilateral eye movement with a client. And something happened in that session where that client just kind of kept her gaze in one place, actually. Like she didn't do the back and forth movement. And what he found is when she kept her gaze, she started to really process what was going on, what she was working on. And she came back after that session saying that she felt a lot better. I think the story was that she was training for the Olympics. She was an ice skater. And she just kept on, she couldn't get one of, the movements or the turns. Like she kept on falling. And she was working on the performance of it. And she kept her gaze there. She kept, processing that fear of failure, that fear of falling again. And when she did that, she came back, at least this is what the story is, and said, I was able to do that triple axel and I was able to land and feel confident and feel good. And he found that to be very powerful. So he started developing what we call brain spotting now, where again, the idea behind it is where we look impacts how we feel. So I could be processing a memory, and maybe if I look in this direction, it feels very activating for me. Like I feel the pain from that memory, and it's going into the subcortical parts of our brain, what I talked about earlier. But maybe if I look here, if I look directly ahead of me and I'm thinking about that memory, I feel a little bit more neutral, so I can process and go into a more neutral space from the memory. So you're still exposing yourself to that trauma memory, and you're looking at a particular what we call brain spot to process that experience. It's a little hard to explain until you actually do it, but I find that it's actually a very gentle way to process trauma. I also find that, for some individuals swear by EMDR and they love it, and that's great. But some people kind of find EMDR a little bit too activating for them. So we try brain spotting, and they actually say to me that actually felt like a much gentler way to process the traumatic experience. So we're still going into the deeper, what we call subcortical parts. We're going into our limbic system. We're going into the hippocampus to process those memories.
So how do you help somebody find that spot?
It's trial and error. So with brain spotting, we explore. I have what we call a pointer. And so we explore. If it's done virtually, then we do it on the screen. If it's done in my office, we explore, think of that memory. Think of what you want to work on. Notice how that memory feels when you look in this direction. We take a pause and we do that. Then I ask them, okay, let's look in this direction. Notice how that memory feels when you look in that direction. And they'll tell me, they'll say, I actually felt more intensity in my chest when I looked at it here. In this direction, I actually felt a little bit more calm. And so we give the client free rein as to where they want to go. Do they want to process it from a more neutral space or from a more activating space?
That's really interesting. I think all of these are just really interesting techniques that I hope more and more people try out for themselves and see which is best for them. Is there anything you recommend for people to practice if they can't currently afford therapy? Maybe it's something they want to do down the road, but currently can't afford it.
Yeah, so I definitely recommend, if you can't afford to go to therapy, do your own research, I guess, is the best way that you can call it. If you want to work on improving your relationships, there's a lot of really wonderful relationship books out there. Gottman books are really great. Terry Real books are really great. If you want to work through understanding trauma a little bit better, there's so many amazing books on, what trauma means, what trauma recovery looks like. Bessel van der Kolk's book, Peter Levine's books are really great for understanding trauma a little bit better. So you can at least start by doing your own research. You can do some of the coping skills that we've talked about, like the grounding exercises, exercising, movement. But the biggest thing I would say is engaging your social support system. So much of survivors, unfortunately, feel like they're alone in their lives and alone in their experiences. And that's not reality, but somehow shame and our brain tells us that we are alone. So it's important to have your own support system so that if one day you are feeling down, you have somebody to call. Now, they're not a therapist, so they're not able to necessarily offer you the therapeutic advice, but you're able to still go to someone and hopefully not feel like you're by yourself in the process.
I think for me, I have certain friends of mine that I'm like, they're really receptive to hearing me vent sometimes. Sometimes I just need to vent. Sometimes I don't even need a response out of you. I just need to vent and like just get it off my chest and tell you about my day or something I experienced or whatever, especially because I'm currently single and I live in a place by myself. So I'm like, sometimes I'm like, hey, I need to go grab a beer, just vent for a second. Then I'm like, once I get that off my chest, we go back to having a normal conversation.
Yeah.
But I know which of my friends I can kind of do that with or just call my mom, so it always helps to know who are those people in your close friends and close family and whatnot that you feel that comfort to be able to have those conversations with and not feel judged or not feel criticized or anything like that. It goes back to that freeze response. Sometimes if we feel like we don't want to open up to people because we don't want somebody to judge us or criticize us, but we all know those people in our lives that are those people that we can open up to. And I find for me it's really beneficial to talk about something if it's something I need to get off my chest.
Totally. That's a really great thing that you do for yourself.
So going into loved ones, if someone has a family member or a loved one that has gone through some sort of traumatic event, and they seem like they're suppressing it, is there anything that we can do to help somebody who's going through something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the basic thing that you can do is to just share compassion, share with them that, maybe you don't know what happened, but that you want to support them, that you're open to talking with them, that you're open to listening, you're open to supporting in any way that you can. And really be that sort of, like I said, support system for the individual. We can't force someone to, let's say, get the help. We can't force someone to go into therapy. We can't force someone to go into like a 12-step group if they have addiction issues. But we can say to them like, hey, I'm noticing that you've been seeming like you've been down lately. Like what's going on? Is there anything that I can do? It sounds like you may need to talk to someone. Can I help you with that? Offering that support and offering that compassion is such an important gift that you can give a loved one in your life. Now, again, if you're not a therapist, maybe you don't have all the answers for them, but it's important to say like, I don't have the answers, but I'm here to help you, in any way that you think you need help.
There we go. And then, these are just kind of some bonus questions, more I guess a bonus question about you, and then a few last things. So do you ever feel the need to talk to a therapist because of some of the stories and emotions that you experience on a regular basis through different therapy sessions?
Yes, I'm a lifelong person that receives therapy. I've been in therapy since probably my graduate school program. I don't think I could really offer and do this work unless I did this work myself. I'm not going to ask a client to do something that I'm not willing to do for myself. So I do my own, self-work as well. It's not necessarily that I'm doing the EMDR and like the trauma stuff right now, but I do like to go deep and explore within myself as well. So yeah, it's something that I do actually even share with my clients, because I think oftentimes clients think that us therapists, we have things all together, but we're human too. We've lived through this pandemic. It's been hard for everyone. So yeah, I'm someone that believes in it. I do it. And I wouldn't ask my clients to do anything that I wasn't willing to do.
How do you typically de-stress after, if let's say there's several sessions that are pretty emotionally exhausting? Is there anything that you do after a day like that?
Yeah, like I said, I'm such a big movement person, so I like to go work out after having a long day of therapy sessions. I think laughter is so important, so I try to laugh with my husband, laugh with my dog. I try to watch something funny, and I'm actually pretty good at like separating like work Janet, the therapist Janet, with like the person Janet. So I think having that ability to compartmentalize can be helpful here. But yeah, movement is big for me to kind of get out of like, okay, now I don't have to be a therapist. Now I can go take care of myself.
And then to wrap up, is there anything you'd like to tell anyone who's listening to this podcast who may be nervous but is thinking about contacting you or a therapist in their local area?
Yeah, I just want to normalize that it can be scary. I remember my first time reaching out to a therapist. I had no idea what to expect. I look back and I lucked out. I had a really positive first experience with a therapist, but I'll say sometimes it takes several tries to find the person that's the right fit for you. And, the biggest thing I would say is, You can schedule telephone consultation calls. Most therapists will offer that, where you can talk to them for 10 to 15 minutes over the phone to get a better sense of who they are as therapists, how they practice. And the point of doing that also, not only to ask questions, but to see how you feel. Do you feel comfortable talking to them? Do you feel like they understood you and understood your questions? So sometimes it takes several tries, several phone calls to find the right fit for you, and that's okay. You can be picky. It's your time. It's your money. And the biggest thing I would say is it's important that you feel comfortable and safe with that person, because you won't make headway in therapy if you don't feel comfortable in that particular space.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to, just because you're deciding to go see a therapist doesn't mean that you are going to feel comfortable with every single therapist, and that you got to make the call on who is the right person for you, but also don't be ashamed or I guess blame yourself if for whatever reason you don't feel comfortable with that person. I almost look at it as like an auto mechanic, right? There's certain auto mechanics where you're like, I trust this person, that they're going to tell me exactly what I need done to my car, and they're not going to bullshit me. They're just going to tell me, I got a guy in Burbank. He's my guy. I trust him with my life. But there's certain other auto mechanics that when I would go see them for my car, I was like, I don't trust this guy. I don't something about him I just don't feel right,
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's the same thing with therapy or with anything like that. A dentist, an eye doctor, whatever. You have to feel comfortable with that person, because you're putting a lot of a lot onto them, and you need to make sure that you feel comfortable with what you're offloading, right?
Sure.
And so find that right person for you. Take your time with it. Be patient. Ask the questions that you feel like you need to ask to feel comfortable, and then go for it. And even that, I called you before we decided to do the podcast, because I wanted to make sure, hey, is this a conversation that's going to help people? Is this somebody who I'm going to feel comfortable talking to? Because it's a tough subject. I wanted to make sure, and that's why I asked you to redo it, because I was like, I don't feel like I did my best on the first one, not because of anything that you did, but I just feel like I was so nervous about the subject that I ended up, just not asking the best questions. And now, after getting done with this one today, I feel great about it. I'm excited to put this out. I feel like it's gonna be really helpful for a lot of people and things like that. And so, it's important I was nervous when I called you to say, hey, like I think we can do better on the podcast. I wasn't my best. Would you be open to redoing this? And, part of me was like, hey, she might say no. She charges by the hour. So there's a chance that she says no. And I was so grateful that you said yes. And now that we're wrapping up here, I just want to say thank you again for doing this. And I feel great about this episode, and I'm looking forward to, people either reaching out to you or reaching out to a local therapist in their area. And I'm looking forward to putting this one out.
Yeah. And thank you for talking about this. I know it's not the easiest subject to talk about, but I think you did a great job either way, this conversation and the last conversation, but I'm definitely happy to be here to continue that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I definitely feel like we'll probably end up having a round 3 and have some more subjects to talk about and more questions as people listen to the first one. And so for right now, can you plug your socials? Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Therapy with Janet B. I'm on TikTok, The Dancing Therapist. My website is roadtowellness.co. So you can inquire about our services. On my Instagram, I like to put out a lot of mental health content out there, so feel free to follow, feel free to share. And I'm happy to connect.
Well, there we go. So thank you again for coming on, and thank you everybody else for listening. And I hope this leads to some awesome conversations, and it's really helpful for a lot of people. So thank you again for doing this, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
See you guys.